Morning, guys. I hope that you are doing well and staying warm. It's Tuesday, and it was like almost 80 degrees on Sunday. It was mid 60s and warm and sunny on Monday. And it's Tuesday right now, and it's in like the 30s or 40s, and it's cold again. And that's just not fair to drop like 30 degrees in a couple of days, okay? So I hope you're well. I hope you're hanging in there. We are down to the last 10 days. 10 days in the school year, guys. It's May 5th right now. We are going to be done with the school year on May 15th. That's good. And it's a little bit rough in the meantime because the timeline has been compressed pretty significantly. And so we are working through what we have left, and we're going to do this, I think, relatively well. And so here's what's going to happen. We're going to talk through some material related back to the podcast that you listened to on Monday that had to do with C.S. Lewis and storytelling and the way that Lewis shapes a lot of his theological presentations and symbols and imagery and things like that from the Narnia Chronicles, okay? But what I'm going to do is sort of take what Lewis has done in that regard and his ideas with the way that we present theology in our storytelling and things like that, and weave that back into what do we do with the biblical texts and how do we deal with what is going on in the story narratives and then the construction of the literature in the Bible, and then we're going to work from there. So a couple of quick notes on those things, and then we'll be done with this particular video. So let me do it this way. In the last, well, actually, let me stop here. If you need something as we get down to the last 10 days, reach out, send me an email, let me know, let's communicate and make sure that you guys have what you need as we approach the end of the school year. Okay. So that's the first thing. Second thing, okay, so for juniors, right? If what we're talking about was C.S. Lewis and storytelling and the way that the literature shapes our access to what's going on with the theology of the Bible, then my biblical theology class would be one to take. I know, shameless plug, reference, whatever. Take the biblical theology class if this information is anywhere remotely sort of like, hey, wow, I might be interested in that, because we deal with that expressly in that bib theology class. Okay. Now, take a little breather. Make sure you've got your notes. Okay. Have a little coffee, and let's get moving toward what we need to talk about. Okay. So first things first. C.S. Lewis and the idea of storytelling. Lewis argues in a lot of his critique of critique not necessarily being negative. In the way C.S. Lewis understands how good storytelling is accomplished in literature. One of the things that he articulates is the atmosphere of the story is more important than plot and characterization and the rest of it. So for Lewis, the way in which we tell the story with the embedded themes and images and messages that need to come with it should be done in such a way that the whole story has this undergirding atmosphere, this feel, so that as you read the story, you intuit those things that are most critical to the theme and the development of the story without even necessarily being aware of it. So, for example, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the Narnia Chronicles. Aslan as a character and the atmosphere of the story has this identification with common characteristics to the medieval depictions of Jupiter in the mythology, right? And what Lewis is doing is he's taking these elements that belong to these mythological stories regarding Jupiter, Jove, and he's arguing or he's saying that he sees in Christ these characteristics, these kingly, regal, redeeming characteristics, the one who makes kings out of others. And Lewis has woven the story together in such a way that not just in the character of Aslan, but in the elements of the story itself, in the themes and the atmosphere, in the setting and the plot. It's this all-encompassing sort of vibe to what is going on in the story that has created this sort of Jupiter-esque feel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Likewise with The Silver Chair and the Moon, with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader and the Sun, there are these key elements that the story is shaped to highlight, even though the story doesn't do it necessarily explicitly. Okay. So then for Lewis, theology is actually embedded not only in the elements of the story on the surface, but it's embedded in the way we tell the story. So it matters when you read the Chronicles of Narnia to not just read and see Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as the redeeming figure, as the king figure. It matters to read the way Lewis tells you the story, because the way in which you're told the story also develops, probably in deeper ways, the theology that's present in the stories than just by looking at the characters and the way the characters are presented in the stories. Okay, so then there's an intimate relationship between theology, what we communicate in theology, and how we go about telling stories that highlight, deepen, expand, clarify what we mean when we talk about these elements of theology. Okay, so think perhaps along this kind of line. Biblical imagery is created as stories are told to us, but the imagery in biblical texts permeates beyond just the elements that are present in the story, and it goes to the way in which you're told the story. The two most sort of penetrating interpretive questions we can ask about the scripture are, why am I being told this information? Why does Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, decide to tell me this story, or to tell me this detail in this story? What was his motivation in including this piece of information? And the follow-up question to that is, why does Matthew feel so inclined to tell me that piece of information, or tell me that story about the life of Jesus in the way he tells it? And I would say the same would be true for what Lewis had to say about literature. Not only why this story, but why am I told this story in this way? What does the presentation of the story do for us in understanding what's going on with the story? And I think both of those things are getting at what C.S. Lewis talked about in his reflections on being in his tool shed, when he said, you can stand outside the ray of sunlight and you can see what is illuminated by the light. And this is sort of the why this material in this story, what is being illuminated for us. But then you can step into the why in this way by stepping into the light of the sun coming into the tool shed. And now instead of seeing what is illuminated, you see in the light, because now you stand sort of immersed in it. Well, there are two things that I want to highlight from the biblical text that I think begins to articulate some of these ideas, and I want to talk through these things. They're both from our First Testament texts, and so you can go there. And then I'll have some general ideas that kind of wrap this up, and I'll probably have a link in this video to a devotion I did for the staff and faculty in YouTube that piggybacks off of some of the material in the Job passage that we're going to look at. Okay, so The first of these places is Job chapter 9 and Job chapter 38. We're in the book of Job, and we're looking at these passages, okay? And there's a lot going on with the text of Job. At the beginning of the year, we looked at Job, and we looked at Job as a piece of wisdom literature, okay? Here's my question. If we're looking at Job, and we would like to characterize God in the book of Job, how would you do that? You only have the book of Job to work from, and the question is this: what kind of character is God in the book of Job? Write me out some description. You can press pause on the video. Write out some description. What kind of character is God in the book of Job? Okay, you've done that. If we take the narrative sections, Job 1 and 2, the end of the book, Job 41, and 42, really it's 42. And we just look at the narrative pieces to it. God seems a bit distant. God seems like he's in control of what is going on, but God also seems a bit confusing. He cares for Job, he obviously does, and yet he allows some pretty incredible things to happen to Job. And the combination of what happens to Job and what God allows to happen to Job and God's care for Job present us with some tension. Okay. And we aren't necessarily sure what to do with the tension. It's pretty clear, though, that God's in control. He's sovereign. He's over all of it. Everything happens either because, everything happens in the text of Job because he allows it, or because he directly does it at the end when he restores all of Job's stuff to him. But that leaves us with some question. Is he just sort of distant, caring but distant, or is there some other piece to the nature of God in character? Well, enter this particular segment of the storyline. In Job chapter 9, Job is voicing his tension and his idea of God as great and mysterious and majestic and wonderful. God's beyond comprehension in Job chapter 9, especially in the first 10 verses, and that's where we're looking. And Job articulates these things that he acknowledges belong solely to God, but are well beyond our ability to comprehend. So, for example, he says in verse 3, if someone wished to contend with him, with God, one could not answer him once in 1,000. God can ask you 1,000 questions, and you wouldn't be able to answer a single one of them. God is wise in heart, he says, and mighty in strength. He removes the mountains. He overturns them. It's all very pessimistic, right? It's all very jaded because of Job's experience and his circumstance, but he's acknowledging the wonder and power and the majesty of God as he says these things. Verse 6, he says that he shakes the earth out of its place and the pillars of the earth tremble. This ancient idea that the earth was actually founded on a set of pillars that upheld it. We'll perhaps talk more about that. He commands the sun and it doesn't rise. Again, God's giving the command. God's the one who's in command here. He's in authority. He's in control. He's the sovereign. But in Job's perspective here, it's very jaded. It's very pessimistic. It's very negative. He commands the sun. It doesn't rise. He seals up the stars. He has stretched out the heaven, but now he's sealed up these stars. He says that he's trampled the waves of the sea. He's made peace out of the chaos. The sea, this ancient symbol, especially in Hebrew literature in the First Testament, of chaos and disorder and fear and death and the unknown. God has calmed it. He's the stiller of the sea, the bringer of order to all things chaotic. And then he mentions 3 constellations specifically. He made the Bear, Orion, and the Pleiades. Okay. Verse 10, he says, he does great things beyond understanding and marvelous things without number. God's fantastic. He's beyond our imagination. And yet in Job's perspective, this is all very jaded. It's all very pessimistic. Job struggles to see, like I think we do if we only focus on the narrative sections of the book of Job, Job struggles to see this good God and how God's goodness relates to his care for Job when that God is also the sovereign of the universe. And God's answers to Job, widely considered, address the fact that Job's perspective isn't complete enough to fully understand what's going on in God's cosmic understanding of the universe itself. All well and good. However, I think what we typically overlook is what happens, and I didn't really notice this until just a few days ago, what happens in the beginning of chapter 38. We've looked at the first 10 or so verses of Job chapter 9. Job 38 is the chapter in which God begins to speak to Job directly. Here's what happens. The first 10 verses and those specific admissions that I just listed you through in Job chapter 9 are all mentioned directly by God back to Job in Job chapter 38. If we ask the question, why am I told this information? Why does it matter? Why am I told this information? Why am I told that God asks questions of Job that just so happen to correspond with the questions Job asked or Job admitted? Why are God's questions the exact same things Job admitted demonstrate the majesty and splendor of God in Job chapter 9? Why does that matter? Well, I think it matters because God's beginning his conversation with Job exactly where Job has started his conversation of the majesty and grandeur and splendor of God. Why am I told this information in the way in which I'm told it in Job chapter 38? Well, I'm going to highlight some verses for you in a second, but the basic tenor of it is this. Job's perspective in chapter 9 is jaded. It's pessimistic, it's negative, and we can understand that given his experience. Job chapter 38, however, has God addressing the same sets of concerns. The same elements Job has admitted demonstrate the majesty of God without the jadedness of Job's experience. Okay. It works a little bit like this. Job 38, verse 1 through 4. Okay, Job admitted that God is wise beyond understanding, and nobody can answer him if he challenged them with 1,000 questions. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Okay. And he says, gird up your loins like a man, and I will question you, and you will declare to me. I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to answer them. Now, interesting enough, when we get to the end of this dialogue, Job says to God, see, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. He's already said this stuff in chapter 9. Now in chapter 40, when Job speaks back to God, he says, I don't have an answer for any of your questions, which is exactly what Job already said in Job chapter 9. And God starts right there. Answer my questions, man. Now, Job chapter 9, verses 4 through 6, talk about the foundations of the earth and things being set and the seas being marked out for its boundaries and this kind of a thing. Verse 4, God starts in that place, and he says this, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. There's that element of wisdom laced back in. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Who shut in the sea with its doors, laid its boundary markers? Oh. And he goes on. In 38, God begins his questions with Job in the same place Job began his admission of the majesty of God, the incomprehensibility. In Job 38, though, the perspective is not this jaded perspective from Job, who says that God's doing all of these things in a rather negative way. Remember, in Job chapter 9, God's shaking the foundations of the earth. Here, he's establishing them. What's present here is the good, the order, the peacefulness of what God has established. Job's lack of peace is due to his circumstance, but that doesn't change the peace and the order that was present when God laid the foundations of the earth. So what you have in Job 38 is God speaking directly to where Job started the conversation in chapter 9, but without Job's jaded perspective. So that's part of this. In Job chapter 9, verse 7, he talks about the morning, commanding the sun to not rise. Well, verse 12 of chapter 38, God says, have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? Instead of God commanding the sun to not rise, in Job 38, God says, listen, I command the morning every day, and the dawn knows its place because I gave it that structure, that order. Why am I being told this information? Because what God says relates directly to what Job has said. He's meeting Job where he's at. Second, why am I told this in this way? Because it's a very different approach to what Job has already started. In chapter 9, verse 8, we talk about the sea, and here we have it in 38, verse 16. Have you entered the springs of the sea or walked the recesses of the deep? In 9 and 10, Job is talking about the stars. In 38, 31 through 33, God starts to speak of the stars. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season, or guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? He's talking about the constellations, and he mentions the same three constellations, Orion, the Pleiades, and the bear, that Job mentioned in chapter 9. Now, why does any of that matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. Number one, God's beginning his story. God's beginning his conversation with Job exactly where Job started the conversation of God's majesty and greatness and incomprehensibility. And so now God has entered the conversation about God's incomprehensibility in the same place Job started it. Why does it matter that we're told this information in the structure of the way Job 38 is presented to us? Because it's missing Job's jaded perspective. What Job sees as chaotic and disorganized and painful, God has represented to Job in 38 and 39 and 40 as ordered, structured, peaceful. We may not be able to see it, but that doesn't mean that it isn't there. You see, it's the opposite perspective in Job chapter 38, but it's the opposite perspective of the same sets of issues and challenges. And so the challenge in 38 and 39 and 40 in this dialogue between God and Job isn't that Job's been wrong. It's that Job's perspective has clouded things that he was otherwise capable of seeing. Perhaps our lives get a bit like that. Our perspectives get jaded. Our hearts are broken. We find ourselves struggling. And the answer isn't necessarily that God is something less than this great thing in the universe. Perhaps the answer is the fact that God is that great thing. But the perspective needs to be shifted back to the admission that God is that great thing who has brought peace and order to what feels like chaos to us. Well, the theology of Job chapter 38 is not just embedded in the details of what God says to Job, but it's embedded in the perspective that comes with what God says to Job. Another one of these stories is the Exodus story, and we're going to kind of overview it as we go through this. But the Exodus story has a couple of really critical points, and it highlights again that God's tendency is to enter the frame of the story where the characters of the story are living. God breaks in to the story in the Exodus with the declaration that he's heard the cry of distress from Israel in the wilderness. And then he sets about doing something about that cry of distress, because the cry of distress matters to him. So why am I told this information? Why am I told that God enters the story here at this moment? Why doesn't God enter the story somewhere else? God meets the characters of the Exodus where they're at. He doesn't wait for them to come out of their captivity to meet them. He meets them in their captivity and moves them out of it. He meets Job in the chaos. He meets Job in the jadedness of his perspective, and he moves Job out of it. Okay. Why does the story get told to us and constructed in ways that it does? Well, because it highlights for us this movement. When we begin the plagues, Israel is included amongst the struggle in the water turned to blood and some of the others. Very shortly in the plague events, though, there is a distinction made between Israel and Egypt. And God says, I'm making this distinction so that you know I'm the Lord. I'm Yahweh. I'm the one who will take care of you and deliver you. Right? And so we have this tension in the way that these stories are presented. It's not just that there are characters in our stories presented to us in certain ways, especially God when he shows up as a character in our stories. But the way in which the story is constructed and the way in which the presentation of God in the story is shown to us shapes the theology that's there. What we don't typically do is read for that broader, pervasive sort of presentation, like Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia presenting Aslan to us, and then presenting the elements of Aslan's kingship, of this Jupiter motif, to the broader story that ties it all together. We read for the characters and the characterization. We read for the obvious moments of imagery when Aslan is sacrificed, or when Job is struggling, or fill in the blank. We read for these obvious moments, but we don't read for the atmosphere in the presentation of the story. Biblical imagery and biblical allusion, the fact that Job 38 begins exactly where Job started in Job chapter 9, and God's dialogue with Job begins exactly where Job began, is significant. We often don't read for that. And that, I think, is what Lewis was trying to accomplish with some of the way that he presented his material in theology by presenting it in stories. Because the story goes a long way in highlighting for us what's going on with the theology. Not just because the story tells us something, but because the story is presented to us in a particular manner. So it's not just what the story says on its face that matters to us. It's how the story says it that matters to us. And that's true in Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, and it's true in the texts of Scripture. We'll pick up there next time. I hope you guys are doing well. We'll talk to you soon.